Hello and welcome to another episode of Research Radio, a podcast of the Economic and Political Weekly. I'm Johan, and today we have with us Sanjana Meshram and Aditya Rawat discussing conservation law in India and how it perpetuates Brahminical environmentalism. Sanjana Meshram is a lawyer and heads the litigation team at the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project in Bhopal. Aditya Rawat is a law student and an intern with the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project. Thank you both for joining us today. I would like to begin with a question about your organization. And I was just wondering, what is the interest of the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project in conservation law?
Yeah, thank you so much, Johan, for that introduction. We are really glad to be here. A very warm Jai Bhim and Johar to all the audience and to Johan. To introduce our organization, we are the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project is co-founded by Nikita Sunavne. We are a litigation and research intervention committed to ending the disproportionate targeting of oppressed communities by the criminal justice system. As a grassroots intervention, we use data driven research and human rights lawyering to support oppressed communities, advocate for decriminalization and decarceration. We do this through research, litigation, and research driven advocacy. So, we thought of doing this research from the lens of Brahminical environmentalism because, as we are committed and we are working for oppressed caste communities like Dalit, Adivasi, and denotified tribes, we knew that the Adivasi communities have a history of related to forest, and they are also known as the forest dwelling communities and other forest dwelling communities. So from the lens of Brahminical environmentalism, we want to do research on the Wildlife Protection Act to show that how this act is using disproportionately used by the forest department to criminalize the livelihood of these communities and criminalize the rights of these communities. That's why we thought of uh, bridge a gap between the conservation and environmental environmentalism from the lens of conservation. So that's why we thought of doing this research in the first place.
Before we proceed, I just wanted to, for the sake of clarity of concept, I wanted to ask what is Brahmanical conservation or Brahmanical environmentalism? What do you mean by this concept?
Yeah, so Johan, Brahminical environmentalism is a mode of environmentalism where Brahmanism determines conservation and environmental protection ideas without sort of considering the indigenous or Adivasi centrality of forests. So, this idea was propounded by the late scholar and activist Abhay Khaka, and he said that Brahminical ideology sort of looks at the world through a very narrow binary of purity and pollution, which is essentially the caste system. And this binary is organized according to the caste system, where those who are pure, which is dominant caste groups, upper caste, oppressor caste, they have special powers and privileges, and those who are polluted, and this is often used to refer to, Dalits, Adivasis, other oppressed castes, and religious minorities who are excluded from having any power or resources. So, this is the Brahminical perspective, and what Brahminical conservation does is it sees forests as these pure and sort of pristine spaces which have to be protected from pollution by preventing the entry of polluted. But they also use other terms such as encroachers to define people, indigenous people, people belonging to Adivasi communities who have been living in and around these forests for so many years. And there's also constant erasure of this detailed history of the symbiotic relationship that Adivasi communities have shared with the forests by the dominant caste social scientists, intellectual, conservationists, etc., which also sort of hints towards this epistemic violence. So, what I'm trying to get at is that Brahminical conservation essentially does two things, right? It normalizes a caste supremacist binary of pure, pristine vis a vis forest conservation, and also routinely engages in epistemic violence against the oppressed castes. So, this then dictates policy making aspect, which results in legislations which routinely criminalize and also subjugate the Adivasi and forest dwelling communities in this country. And also in our paper, we have also talked about how Brahminical conservation at its core is an Indian variant of the exclusionary but well known colonial fortress conservation model as well. So, yeah.
You mentioned in your paper that the prevailing attitude to conservation in India is the fortress model that has roots in colonialism. Could you tell us a bit more about the relationship of colonialism with the prevailing Brahminical approach?
Yeah. So conservation efforts through law in India, especially under British colonial rule, were done for, I think, only one purpose, which was to create monopoly over forest lands in order to ensure that they could efficiently exploit the forest resources and maximize revenue generation. Very simply put, conservation was merely a facade, to get hold of the forest lands, create monopolies, and this was
Mhm.
done via passing legislations back during colonial times by the colonial administrators, such as the Indian Forest Act, and then subsequent amendments were made to it. And so, what the colonial government fully did is it fully embraced the fortress conservation model, which begets the question that what is it essentially, right? So, what the fortress conservation does is that now that you have a clear idea of what is the underlying motive, right? It is to create a monopoly over the forest lands. So now what the fortress conservation model advocates for is that the best way to maintain biodiversity is to establish protected regions everywhere within the ecosystem so that they can operate independently without any human interference, right? It is also known as in some countries as protective conservation, which presupposes that local communities, and this is the problematic part of fortress conservation, because it looks at local communities and looks at them as these exploitative actors who are there to destroy the natural resources, use it irrationally, and they are the only ones leading to biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, right? So this is also similar to how under Brahminical conservation the oppressor caste or dominant caste groups engage in epistemic violence against oppressed caste. And similarly, the colonizers had this white supremacist idea behind this, because the fortress conservation model was implemented in a lot of countries, right? And essentially, so now that we have a clear idea of what this fortress conservation model is and how it has a very museum look of it and how it must be protected from encroachers, essentially the indigenous people. Now that we know that, and we look at the argument that I made previously, which is Brahminical conservation is a variant, as in is an Indian variant of the fortress conservation model. But the one major difference is that instead of white supremacy being the underlying factor, which is the case of fortress conservation, caste supremacist ideas often are at the core of Brahminical environmentalism or Brahminical conservation for that matter.
Mhm, mhm. What I'm also interested in is this use of the law to crystallize the Brahmanical model of conservation. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit more concretely, because I remember in your paper you mentioned the criminalizing of hunting and the policing of protected areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing is, just how as I said before, Brahminical conservation is an Indian variant of fortress conservation model. So a lot of the laws that were implemented back then are quite, and so basically the post-independence laws surrounding conservation and pre-independence laws surrounding conservation are not that essentially different. As in, they have the fortress conservation model, an exclusionary model at their core, and but to be more precise, I would like to take the example of, say, the Wildlife Protection Act, right? So it was
Mhm,
introduced in 1972 to essentially protect wildlife and ensure ecological security of the country. So, but and this is what a lot of scholars have also said, is that it is a successor to a lot of colonial laws that existed before it. And the laws, even though it has had successive amendments, still retains a lot of those colonial ideas and perspective surrounding conservation. And one way in which it becomes very apparent is when you look at the legislative history, right? And this is just a slight detour before I get back to the specific details. But when you
mhm,
look at how these laws were created as well, right? Like when you look at the legislative history, we see that back when the Wildlife Protection Act was, being notified, only tribes from Andaman and Nicobar Islands and their rights to use forest microproduce were recognized, and no other, indigenous community or Adivasi community for that matter had their rights recognized, which goes on to show that at the very outset, there was a very clear flaw, which is a very clear gap of knowledge. And what it does is that, and then you add in the very exclusionary and very rigid framework, which is the fortress conservation model. And then you sort of realize when they interlink and work in conjunction, you see how, there are so many stringent laws under the Wildlife Protection Act. For example, and this is something we have seen in the wildlife policing report, which was released recently in the month of January of this year by our organization. So in this, we saw that, forest departments used a lot of sections against accused with very wide scopes, right?
Mhm.
Such as
Mhm.
section, for example, such as section 26 of the Indian Forest Act, and also, certain sections of the Wildlife Protection Act, like 9, section 9, section 27. And the reason why they're so problematic is because they are very broad. So what section 27 does is it prohibits one entry into sanctuary areas or protected areas. But the problem is these protected areas like national parks or sanctuaries are very huge, and most of the times they're not very clearly demarcated. Even forest officials at times don't have or cannot reasonably estimate what is a protected area or what isn't. So,
Mhm.
like when you don't have clarity around these, very instrumental basic things, and then we have provisions which just sort of give so much arbitrary power to wildlife officials and doesn't also demand a lot of accountability. What happens is that, then we get an understanding of how rigid it can be. And when we look at the facts that have been mentioned, when we mentioned how, the accused in so many cases, they've been facing from a lot of troubles, be it financial ruins, being pushed into a very sort of insidious web of criminalization, we find how, like these frameworks, these laws often, and as Sanjana also mentioned, disproportionately affects, Adivasi people of, to be more precise, oppressed caste forest dwelling communities, which is, SC, ST, and OBC communities living in and around forest areas. Like in most of the cases in our research, and this is something Sanjana will talk about in more detail, but just to give you a heads up, is that in most of the cases, like be it instances of like frivolent cases being filed against for petty offenses which are not even offenses, because apparently we also have a Forest Rights Act which gives, even though gives a lot of rights to people, is not being implemented properly by the state. So what this does is that it ends up disproportionately impacting a lot of people, mostly from, the margins of our society. So yes.
Mhm. I also want to ask, because you mentioned in your paper that the Indian government actually changed its orientation in the 90s to a more community based approach by passing the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act. So, I have two questions about this. The first is, was from what you're saying, it seems to suggest that this was just on paper. But I'm also curious to take a step back and say, what is it that prompted this change to begin with?
Yeah. So yes, as you mentioned, Johan, most of it was just on paper, right? And Sanjana will get into more details of this answer, but just to give you an outset of it, a lot of it was because, as I mentioned before, this act, the Wildlife Protection Act, it was made an act without a lot of indigenous population of our country being consulted, right? So of course there was a lot of movements against it, a lot of widespread struggle against like a lot of Adivasi communities rallied against, like, behind this cause of recognition of rights to use things like microforest produce, have access to these rights that they had before the Wildlife Protection Act came into existence. And these were reasonable rights which did not pose any sort of enormous threat to conservation efforts. But
Mhm.
I think Sanjana can elaborate more on it. So this was my take. Yeah, Sanjana.
Yeah, yeah. So what happened in 1990? The government of India introduced a national forest policy which recognized the importance of involving the local forest dwelling communities in forest protection and management.
Mhm.
So the policy encouraged the formation of village forest committees and joint forest management committee. So which will comprise the local villagers, the local communities and forest department jointly, who will act as a joint committee to manage and protect forest.
Mhm.
So this was in 1990. Then there were so after this there were many many reasons which felt the need for the establishment of such an act which will recognize and safeguard the rights of these communities, and which will actually safeguard the traditions and culture of these communities. So the major what prompted and what contributed to need for such an designation was the historical injustice which was happening with the forest dwelling communities, including the tribal and indigenous population, which were traditionally dependent on forest for their livelihood and cultural identity. But during the colonial era and even after the independence, they faced displacement, exploitation, dispossession of their ancestral land and resources.
Mhm.
But over time, conservation policies in India focused on protecting forest, often which often leads to the exclusion of these communities. So the national park, as Aditya mentioned, the protected areas, which includes the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, were established, which results in the forced eviction of these communities without adequate recognition of their rights.
Mhm.
The another reason was that there was actual need to recognition of indigenous rights. It also what happened is also the grassroots movements and advocacy was very strong, and they played a crucial role in raising awareness about their struggles and demanding legal recognition of their rights. But in also response to these factors and pressing needs for social justice and environmental conservation,
Mhm.
the major need, and looking at all this displacement, eviction, and all these reasons, the pressing need, the main pressing need was for the social justice and environmental conservation. Therefore the scheduled tribe and other traditional forest dwelling recognition of forest rights act was introduced in India in 2006. But as you have asked, we really don't think, from a report that we recently published in January, we did not really think that it translates into the change for the communities in this area. This need was suppressed. This act was suppressed and overpowered by the WPA, the Wildlife Protection Act,
Mhm.
as Aditya has very clearly said and established the concept of Brahminical environmentalism and forest conservation. So the WPA, the Wildlife Protection Act, was created with a view of conserving the forest, and this was from the concept of Brahminical environmentalism, and this concept of Brahminical environmentalism has driven the creation of Wildlife Protection Act. And on the other hand, the Forest Rights Act was created with the vision of making it more inclusive, making the inclusive environmentalism and including the community based approach, uh, uh, and for maintaining and protecting the forest, and looking into the efforts and the love of these communities for the forest. But as we will see that both these acts are created with a very parallel vision. So on the one hand, the Wildlife Protection Act was created from the lens of Brahminical environmentalism. On the other hand, the Forest Rights Act was created from the vision of community based approach. But as you will see that one speaks about exercising power of caste by using a law as a tool and
Mhm.
oppressing certain communities in the name of conservation, and the another speaks about the inclusive framework. So as both these acts are in place and are in so much of tension with one another, if we say that one is using the, in India where caste is the major power to drive everything, to control, to exercise this power over people, land, forest, etc. So if one is creating to oppress, it will automatically, the power of caste will automatically overpower the other community based approach of establishing the Forest Rights Act. So I think they are very parallel to one another, and these communities are termed as encroachers, and they are labeled as the ones who are destroying the forest, who are destroying the who are against the concept of conservation. So both the vision and both the aim and objective of these acts are so parallel to one another that it's very very difficult to have them run parallel with intersection in this country today.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. In December last year, there were some amendments to the Wildlife Protection Act, right? I was just wondering, are there any uh, changes that have helped uh, either ease the tension between these two acts, or has it escalated the tensions between them?
It has definitely escalated the web of criminalization. First, we'll see what amendment has happened. So, this amendment resulted in the increase of animal species protected by the Wildlife Protection Act. It has also increased the penalty manifold, that is for general violation. So, Section 51 of the Act, uh, Section 51 of the Wildlife Protection Act covers the violation of any provision punishing the offender with a sentence up to 3 years in prison or a fine up to 25,000 when the offences involves the animal listed in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 of the Wildlife Protection Act, that is hunting or altering boundaries in a sanctuary or national park. The offender is sentenced to 3 to 7 years in the prison and fine up to 10,000.
Mhm.
So, what happened in this amendment? So, they have increased the penalty. They have increased the penalty for general violation from 25,000 to 1 lakh, and they increase in the penalty of violation of provision related to protected animals from 10,000 to 25,000. So, this increase in the penalty amount is waived as a solid deterrent to ensure that better wildlife protection, to ensure that the wildlife protection is actually happening, but this has also increased and have the very disastrous consequences for many communities and for the tribal, indigenous, and other forest dwelling communities. So, first, we will see that what actually is criminalized under the Wildlife Protection Act and how this amendment of increasing penalties will translate into the increase of more criminalization and the web of criminalization around the lives of these communities.
Mhm.
So, what we have seen from our report is that the bulk of criminalization that occurred under the WPA were not of protected species that comes under the Schedule 1 and 2. But for the bulk of criminalization was for the animals and for the species which are recognized under Schedule 3 or 4, which does not actually require the protection and which are less deserving of protection due to their huge number. So 64.5% of these offenses are for violation of or for the species which are in Schedule 3 and 4. Also, we have seen that additionally fishes which are not even protected in the Wildlife Protection Act filed regular criminalization under the WPA. Under
Mhm.
Schedule 5, anonymously, the species which are coming under Section 3 and 5, and also the fishes which are also recognized as the right as a community right under the Forest Rights Act are regulated as hunting but are disturbing the wildlife habitat. So when we have asked during our interview with the forest department, when we asked and when we tried to push the forest department to think about the Forest Rights Act, which gives these communities the right of fishing as a community right and as an individual right of fishing, the forest department official says that, and I quote that they says, this leaves lesser fish for consumption by wildlife animals, therefore this constitutes depleting of wildlife habitats. This is a offense and this is deserves a punishment and
Mhm.
cases.
Mhm.
There
Mhm.
are also, we have seen that the cases of dry wood cutting, collecting honey and mushroom are all routinely made. It bears noting that the activities that are criminalized are guaranteed as Forest Rights Act under Section 3(1)(d) of the Forest Rights Act 2006. So the the majority of the bulk of criminalization, the majority of the offenses that has been made by the forest department, that is 64.5% of these offenses are majorly for the rights which are recognized under the Forest Rights Act under Section 3(1)(d) of the Forest Rights Act.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah.
I also want to ask about this increase in the penalty from 25,000 to 1 lakh. You mentioned that it is likely to have unintended consequences for local communities. And I find that quite interesting. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah. As I have mentioned earlier, when the offense involves an animal listed in Schedule 1 or 2 of the WPA, that is hunting or altering boundaries in a sanctuary or national park, the offender is sentenced to 3 to 7 years in prison, है ना, and up to fine up to 10,000.
Mhm.
Therefore, in the light of the recent act, which has increased the penalty amount by 4 times, it becomes necessary to analyze how this increase can potentially cause more devastation and complicate the already existing wave of criminalization of oppressed caste communities and forest burning communities.
Mhm.
So, the study we have done, the research we have done of wildlife policing, it reveals that the financial burden the accused bears in these cases can be pretty high for many people implicated in the WPA because the socio-economic position is quite dire. So when an accused person is apprehended, the cost of bail ranges from so it is previous amendment, and after amendment also, it's how I'll speak how the existing situation on the ground is, and how after amendment we'll see the financial burden has increased. So when any accused person is apprehended, the cost of bail ranges from 12,000 to 15,000. Okay. So moreover, each subsequent court appearance add to this cost. This includes the lawyer's fees, bribes to the court personnel, travel to the court from their village, and each appearance in court. So because of this high cost, many have to take out loans with very high rate interest. Our study also finds that the average trial duration was around 4 to 5 years. So the pendency of cases is a lot. In one case, a trial has been going on for more than 16 years, and this was a case of collecting honey, which was also recognized as a right under the Forest Rights Act. Furthermore, we have also seen that the 95% of the cases by the Forest Department between 2016 and 2020 remained unresolved. Out of this, 726, that is 51%, are still pending in court. 627 cases, that is 44.3%, were undergoing departmental proceedings, and 35%, it is 2.4%, were closed without further action. So probably as a result of an offense being registered under the unidentified accused person, right? So the pendency of cases, the loan they have to take, they have to travel, they have to give bribes to the court officials, they have to, so it does not only amounts to the punishment and the fines that are introduced, that is being recognized, that is being given under the Wildlife Protection Act, but we should also look at all these other financial burdens that this act and that the initial days and the whole period of trial is overburdening the accused with. So the fact shows here that there is also an acute case of chronic pendency from the data. So all these things, apart from fine, also all these other things which an accused person has to bear with, it's clear that the increase the penalty amount will lead to massive financial burden, and which will also overpower the Forest Department by further increasing the wave of criminalization of these lives. So the pendency of cases is the major. There is no such case of compounding of these offenses. Also, the pendency is also because the burden of proof is majorly under the WPA is on accused. So the accused has to prove that he has not committed the offense, whereas in the regular criminal trial, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. So they have to establish that this is the accused and he has created the offense. He has committed the offense. But on the other hand, in the WPA, the burden of proof is also on the accused. So the financial burden is not only of the fines, so also of the other. And if you are increasing the fines, so it is automatically strengthening the laws and strengthening the laws of protecting the environment and in the lens of conservation. So I think the fines will also overpower the Forest Department, as the state and as everyone is looking at these communities are encroacher and against the concept of conservation. So they will, if you are increasing the penalties, this will automatically overpower the Forest Department and further criminalize the lives of these communities.
Finally, I want to ask, since your paper concludes with a call for the inclusion of more anti caste perspectives in conservation discourse in India, I was wondering how you see this translating into law, since, as you have argued in the paper, it is through the law that the Brahmanical conservation is being perpetuated. Sanjana, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, sure. But what I want to say here is that what I see is that law is power. Okay. So the power to exercise control over people, forest, land, etc. So law is used as a tool to exercise this power. So in a country like India, where social hierarchy and the social order, where caste system is the key, I will say to maintain this social order and caste system, law is created. As Aditya also said earlier, that according to the lead scholar and activist Abhay Khaka, under Brahminical conservation, forests are seen as pure and pristine, and are to be protected from the polluted. And what is polluting the pure forest and pristine forest is these communities, is the tribal, indigenous, and other forest dwelling communities. So the forest dwelling communities often belonging to the oppressed caste, as encroacher who must be penalized for destroying the sanity of the forest by deterring conservation efforts, right? So, in contrast, the same amount of hostility is not demonstrated towards mining or infrastructure projects, which continues to ravage the Indian forest at an alarming rate. So, its legislative history also shows that the sole sentiment driving the language of the law was the love towards our forest and fear against poaching. So the forest dwelling communities with their own local methods of hunting and forms of hunting such as for subsistence found no mention in this act. So the symbiotic relationship that oppressed caste and forest dwelling communities have shared with the environment over these years makes it necessary to consider the anti-caste perspective, to not only recognize the various stakeholders involved in the process, but to formulate a more inclusive environmental framework. So, to conclude, when the inclusive environmental framework is created, the concept of law and power automatically takes a seat, right? So, when you are, as I've also earlier said, that when you have created a system which is acting very perfectly, we will not say that this is not implementing in ground. The system is only created to, maintain a social order, maintain a caste system. So you have when when the system is only problematic, so it will be definitely perfect run perfectly on the ground as to maintain a social order. So when you have to speak about the implementation of the Forest Rights Act or the recognition of these rights, first you will have to see the aims and objectives of the Wildlife Protection Act and the history of our country, and why this act was created, because it has completely erased the efforts and completely erased the lives and the efforts and the connection of these communities with the forest. After independence, they have started calling these communities as encroacher, as and they have started criminalizing the lives and livelihood of these communities. So the tension between the Wildlife Protection Act and FRA, so if one is created to criminalize the communities and the other is saying that there has to be a community based approach, so how where when the caste is the power in our country, and how and when the caste is when the law is used as a tool to maintain the caste, so it has to be seen in this way, that the system has the problem. The system is actually created to control the caste system by creating laws like the Wildlife Protection Act, and to oppress these communities who has traditionally involved. So I think the more inclusive environmental approach needs to be created by centering the voices of this community and by recognizing the efforts the tribal, indigenous, and other forest dwelling communities has created over this year to protect and maintain the balance between around and between the environment.
Mhm, mhm. Aditya, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had just a few additions with respect to what Sanjana has already said. Now, I'll reiterate one point that I said before, is that if you look at Brahminical conservation, ultimately it's about, it's not just about a Brahminical mode of conservation, but also about a lot of epistemic violence that happens and the way it manifests. And I would like to also mention one example from our report, is the problem of wild boar in our country. So, a lot of MPs during the parliamentary discussions over the amendment bill, asked for the central government to declare wild boars who are protected under the Wildlife Protection Act to be declared as vermin, because they were causing farmers all over the country a lot of trouble, because they were destroying crops and their population has been left unchecked for many years, and they've grown increasingly over the years. And so, specifically in the case of Mandla and Balaghat, the two districts in Madhya Pradesh, which we focused on for the purpose of our report, we found that despite the wild boars being such a huge problem, there being such a public outcry about it, they are still, protected under the Wildlife Protection Act. And there have been cases where people have been charged for protecting their fields against wild boar attacks. And the way it works is, say, for example, you are a small farmer and you're trying to protect your crops. And what happens if a wild boar, and they usually attack in groups, and if a wild boar attacks or tries to attack your field and gets caught in one of the fences and dies, the wildlife officials will not be very charitable with you, and you will be, there's a very high likely you will be charged with what is essentially self defense of your property, right? So this goes on to show how there's a very demanding need to take care of this epistemic violence. And one way, as you know, we have mentioned, is increasing the diversity of voices, not just on the basis of shallow identitarian lines, but also ideological lines as well. And with that, of course, legislations will have to take into consideration a whole lot of effects. It cannot always be about forests being viewed as a money making process or like just for exploitation, because as we have seen or discovered throughout the course of this conversation, is that a lot of people, usually from the margins of our society, are facing a lot of oppression from the wildlife governance administration in the country,
Mhm.
right? And when this is the problem, you need to understand that like simple cut solutions, of course, they will not be sufficient. But the problem here is not even solutions. The problem is, firstly, like there's no additional voices, there are no like critiques of the existing framework that also exists, no broader critiques. So this also contributes to the problem, though not directly, but adds on to it. So yes, as I mentioned, we need more voices to cover different margins of our society. Thank you.
I think those are all my questions for today. Thank you once again, Sanjana and Aditya, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you so much.
And thank you also to our listeners for joining us. You can find the article discussed in today's episode in the show notes, and you can find more episodes of Research Radio as well as our other podcast supplement at epw.in/podcasts. And to experience all that EPW has to offer, head over to epw.in today and subscribe. This is Johan saying bye bye and see you next time on Research Radio.